Scholastic Preaching. Welcome to the Summercast.
Welcome to the Summercast, a podcast aimed at making fundamentalism great again by applying confessional Baptist doctrine to all of life.
Welcome to the Summercast, everybody. It is good to be back in this chair. Haven't been here in a little while. Now, what I want to talk about is Scholastic Preaching. And I actually wrote an article called 4D Homily, or 4D homiletics, or something like that. Or at least that's what it started with. And it's about four-dimensional preaching, four-dimensional homiletics. Now, what do I mean by that? In the article, I clarify and define what that is. And the word dimension really is interchangeable with other terms you could possibly use. And so it's not necessarily a hard and fast term. You could call it the fourfold homily, actually, and it would be just as effective. So in the article, I clarified what that is, fourfold homiletics. Basically, it consists of four parts, right? And this could be either, your 4 points to your sermon, or it could be the 4 parts which are underneath each point in your sermon, depending on how many points you have. And so oftentimes you would have the Puritans who would really use the fourfold distinction throughout the entirety of the sermon. I myself kind of let the text divide up my sermon, so I'll have 3 or 4 points. And then under each of those points, I will employ the full fourfold homiletical strategy. So basically, what are those four folds, right? What are those 4 dimensions? They are the exegetical, the doctrinal, the elenctic, and the practical. So you have the exegetical part, and that's where you're doing your exegetical theology, right? You are opening up the text. And what this looks like in preaching, it looks like making plain the text of Scripture. Whatever passage you're in, let's say this last week was, for us, yesterday was Hebrews chapter 1, verses 8 and 9. And then for a second service, it was Exodus 3, 7 through 10. So for Hebrews, I had 4 points. And then under the first point, I had exegetical part, doctrinal part, elenctic part, practical part. Under the second point, the same. Third point, the same. Fourth point, the same. You get the idea. And so in the exegetical part, you are making the text that you are in at the time plain to the congregation. And then after that, you transition over to the doctrinal part, right? And you might be asking yourself, well, isn't exegesis doing doctrine? Well, not really. Do you find doctrine throughout the course of your exegesis? Yes. But doing exegetical theology and drawing systematic or doctrinal or dogmatic conclusions from that exegesis are distinct things. Okay, so in this strategy, you have the exegetical part, you unfold the text of Scripture, you may make reference to some of the original languages. You might, in order to clarify, of course, in order to make it more plain what the author has intended to communicate, the author being God, of course, and then you also might rely on some commentators, right? But then you move on to the doctrinal part, and what you're doing in the doctrinal part is you're drawing conclusions from that exegesis, right? So you're showing how. You're showing the congregation how you get to a certain doctrine or various doctrines, how that text actually distills down into a loci or a locus of systematic theology, a particular doctrine or multiple doctrines. And so that's what you do in the doctrinal part. You expound on the doctrine that is there in the text of Scripture. You make those conclusions. You draw out those conclusions. In the elenctic part, what you do is you respond to objections against your exegesis and against your doctrine, right? So in the elenchtic part, you actually show the congregation. This is the part where you get to, hopefully by the power of the Spirit, by the grace of God, help to edify the discernment of the congregation by showing them, by holding out to them certain objections that are often made against those doctrines that you've concluded from your exegesis, right? So you respond to objections in the elenchtic part, and that usually takes place by way of affirmations, denials, distinctions, etc. And then after that, you get to the practical part, right? And in the practical part, you apply the doctrine to the congregation, right? To the lives of Christians. The definition of theology, the classical definition of theology, it's not just the study of God. That's not the classical definition of theology. The classical definition of theology is something like the art and science of knowing and living unto God, or just the maybe just like knowing and living unto God rightly. So in the definition of theology, definition of theologia vera, or true theology, that's it. It's to know and live unto God. So, when you go back to those who employed this method, I think this method can even be found in Owen. It's not as explicitly brought out as it is in someone like Peter Van Maastricht, which is really where I got it from. And I don't follow him to a T as far as his method, but he's really what got me thinking about this, and so I have a slight adaptation of what his preaching method is, which is found in the first volume of his work. When you go back to those guys, what you'll find is that this was kind of the norm. This is just how you communicated theology, right? This is how you did it. Right, you opened up the text. You relied on the text of Scripture. Scripture being the ultimate authority in terms of that which is pertinent to faith and life. And so you open up your text, you draw doctrine out of that text, you respond to objectors, and then you apply it to practical living. And it's actually a very simple way of communicating to a congregation or to an audience through a book. But since we are not used to it, it may seem a little cumbersome, maybe not as simple as just simply turning the sermon into pure biblical theology and having it under three points. That's what homilizing has been for the last several decades. It's been here's my 3 points, and then under that I have some exposition of the text. And really, that's not all I don't think that's all you're supposed to. And then maybe at the end, as a footnote, you have the application, right? Some application. And we need to be going deeper than that, I think, with our congregations and with those whom we're writing to, fellow Christians, in the case that you're writing a book. We need to be willing, and I think another thing is in preaching, first of all, doctrinal, theological preaching has been downplayed, has been excluded in favor of pure exegetical preaching, right? Just simply doing biblical theology, just simply interpreting the text, right? Or just restating the text in a more creative way, trying to find creative ways to restate what the text has already said. And I don't think that's really what we should be doing. I don't think that's what we should be having in view. I think we don't need to be scared as pastors, and we don't need to be afraid to not only unfold the text, but also draw theological conclusions. Some of those theological conclusions might be a little heady, but your job as a pastor is to bring those down to the congregation so that they can hopefully understand them. These are people you're preaching to, people who don't sit in a study all day throughout their week, who aren't familiarizing themselves with these categories day in, day out. So don't be afraid to get into heady theology. Just make sure that you bring that theology down and construe it in a simplified manner. And also, don't be afraid to respond to objections. Every time I preach a sermon, every time I prepare a sermon, I found it to be the case that there's always something that I'm talking about or that I'm preaching that has been objected to at some point, either currently or throughout church history, which means it's going to come back at some point in time, right? There's always objections out there to everything you're going to preach. And so there's always a place to respond to objections. Now, I will say that if I'm running over time, the elentic part will be the part that I will jump over. Only because I think what takes precedence is the exegetical, the doctrinal, and then how that applies to the congregation. And, of course, you can address objections later on down the road when questions arise or whatever. And so I will jump over that elentic part throughout the course of preaching if I have to. If I know I'm going to go over, if I know I'm going to go over time in an unreasonable sense, right? Like if I know I'm going to be like way too long, so I'll skip over the elentic part and jump straight to the practical. That's another good benefit of dividing your sermon up this way. So sometimes if you have a manuscript or an outline where, well, it's easier for the guys who outline, I guess, to jump when they need to jump. But for those of us who manuscript, it's a little bit difficult, I think, to decide what part you're going to cut on the fly, if you need to cut. And because usually you have your 3 points, and then under each of those points you have your argument or your exegesis of the text, and you have them in paragraphs. Maybe you have them single space, maybe you have them double space. But nevertheless, it might be a little difficult to figure out what you should cut and what you should not cut. Maybe you found yourself, preaching, and you've decided to do a little editing on the fly and cut a part, and you accidentally cut that which you wish you wouldn't have cut. And maybe you cut a very prevalent or very important part of your sermon that really needed to be in there, and another part could have been cut. One of the benefits of like a fourfold homily is that you're going to have, your exegetical part. You're going to have your doctrinal part. You're going to have your elentic part, your practical part. And so your sermon is nice and divided up into these parts, and that way you can take the whole elentic part, for example, and say, okay, well, I'm going to set that aside because we're going to run over time here, and I'm going to jump straight to the practical. And throughout your sermon preparation, when you're doing that, when you're actually construing your elentic part, you know what's in there. You know what's in there, and so you know that you don't want to, you know whether or not that's something that you can cut. A little bit ahead of time, prior to preaching, prior to Sunday, like maybe Saturday evening, I'll read through my manuscripts, and I'll have an idea of what can be cut and what can't be cut, just in case I need to do some editing on the fly. And the elentic part is always my go-to because I know what's said, and I know what it's talking about. I know what it's responding to, and I can, in good conscience, cut it on the fly. So it's helpful to have, your sermon divided up that way. That's kind of just a secondary benefit to the 4D homily. Anyway, I just wanted to talk about that, get you guys thinking about preaching methodology. I think preaching methodology is important. We should be asking ourselves questions like that, right? I'm a very kind of, I'm the kind of person that always wants to go behind the scenes in any given, thought process or doctrinal commitment, and ask, why do we believe these things? Why do we do what we do? Is what we do grounded in any sort of objective or ultimate standard? And I think we should be asking questions like, why is my preaching method the way that it is? And pastors out there have all sorts of different preaching methods, and they're, it's not that they're illegitimate. I don't think they are. But this is just another tool in the toolbox that you can have. And Hopefully it is helpful to you. If this video was helpful to you, please give me a thumbs up. If it wasn't, give me a thumbs down. Let me know why. Click the subscribe button for continued notifications, and well, actually click the bell for continued notifications. Anyways, guys, thank you for joining me on my YouTube channel. God bless. Have a wonderful rest of your day.